a beautiful night in the hood. It's a beautiful night in the hood. Gonna be hanging out in the hood.
Hi, welcome to Almost Cooperstown.
I'm Mark.
And this is Gordon, and we love talking about baseball.
Here we are. It's nearing the end of February, and we would be hoping that we would be talking about the beginning of spring training and how that's seen as a somewhat useless thing nowadays. But unfortunately, there is no baseball news, which is bad baseball news, if we're being honest.
Yeah, I don't even listen to stuff anymore, right? I mean, it's not really interesting to listen to them talk about the would-be starting rotations if you're listening to, MLB Network and all that. I'm just kind of like, just get this thing done.
Right. It's the kind of thing where now it's like, are we really going to, I guess the good thing that I've been hearing everybody been talking about in terms of getting this resolved, that there's not an actual major contractual labor dispute between the two groups, which is what has caused any kind of actual strike to impact the season for pretty much any of the major sports before this. This isn't like back in, 93, 94 when we had the last strike. There was actually a major issue that caused that strike where we really don't have that in this situation. It's more of just...
I think Tony Clark, the Players Association, has gotten hammered for giving away too much last time for creature comforts, better locker rooms, and the players just really want more money, as we've heard, and so on and so forth. But the owners locked them out, obviously, so that they couldn't strike. The owners are saying, look, we're not going to let you start the season. We could play under the old CBA when not have an agreement, but the problem is then the players have the upper hand because as they did in 94, into 95, they struck because they could, because it was the middle of the season and they had a hammer. If they never get into spring training, that the owners are precluding their ability to strike.
To drop that hammer. So kind of puts us in a tough position because there's not as much. And, in the past, we had talked about baseball movies. And I think one of the things about a baseball movie that makes it work so well as a movie is that the game of baseball lends itself really well to the structure of a movie. There's a lot of time, especially if you're doing a movie about characters, you're following a pitcher. You can be on the mound in the pitcher's head, really getting into him in that moment, which, especially with a lot of other faster moving sports, you can't really do that. When I think about football movies, for instance, how many football movies are about the coach? There's a lot of them. Any given Sunday, there's a lot of movies about the coach. Remember, the Titans is ultimately about the coach. Yes, it's a football movie about the team, but you're following the coach. Then there's stuff like Draft Day, which that's not really a football movie, but it's still a movie about football. But I just think that's one of the things that lends itself so well to baseball being a movie is that not only the pace of the game and the ability to have any one given play be a very dramatic thing, but also the 9-inning structure of a baseball game, the length of the season, all that really lends itself very well to a movie type structure, where I think when you look at a lot of other sports movies, it's harder for them to do that, like basketball especially, I think.
Yeah, basketball. And I included soccer, or football if you're not from this country. And I was, we'll get to that later, but I was struck by how few soccer movies there are that are really about soccer. We can get into parsing, the idea of what's a sports movie, right, and what's not a sports movie, and how much sports do you need to have. But we're kind of lumping a lot of them together where they maybe aren't dyed in the wool, team goes ragtag team, that couldn't get it done, the little engine that could, and they won the championship. Yeah, there's only so much of that you can watch. And there's a lot of sports movies that do a great job of going way beyond that.
Yeah. And I mean, if I want to start off talking about other sports movies that I've particularly enjoyed, weirdly, one where there's not a lot of movies, but the ones that there have been are all really, really good is golf movies.
Yeah.
The number of really good golf movies, considering there's only about 50-ish golf movies that have ever been made. The ones that have all been made there are a lot of really, really good movies in there that are both dramas and comedies. There's actually some really funny golf movies.
Well, and to your point, I think, part of it is because you have the time, right? Because golf is not like baseball. It's not fast. So you can kind of, even between swings, if you're showing a player playing during, a round or something like that, you've got the opportunity to have, all kinds of repartee and things happen in the middle of the game as it's happening.
Exactly, because I think you have like something like Tin Cup, which is like you kind of again go back to the fact that Kevin Costner really, if you look at him, is kind of the GOAT of sports movies, just because he's
Yes.
been in so many good ones that
But
like
Adam Sandler gets an honorable mention though.
because which is I think the interesting thing is that there's both Caddyshack and Happy Gilmore for golf movies, so you've got two of the better comedy sports movies right there that are actually pretty good movies. Like I enjoy a lot of them. Even something like The Legend of Bagger Vance was a really good movie, and I
I'm
very
glad
much
you said
enjoyed
that.
it.
Yeah,
But
I agree.
it just,
I like that. It was a little sappy at times, but I like that movie.
and then I think what's interesting is contrasting about all of those movies are very explicitly about the game of golf. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Those are all golf movies. But then you could kind of move over and look at something like basketball, where it feels like a lot of the best basketball movies, putting literally air quotes around basketball, like they just have basketball as sort of like the backdrop of the movie. It's not really what the movie's about in the end.
Well,
Like,
and that's true of movies. If let's be honest, that's it's not always about the sport itself, but some are bigger drivers of the stories.
I think basketball movies and football movies are particular for this. One, because shooting a good looking basketball or football scene is really hard. Like, we've all seen the football scenes in Rudy. They're not great.
yeah. I would go in there would be one of my least favorite football movies, and all the
that is because you are a gigantic USC fan, and the movie of Rudy is just basically lionizing the institution of Notre Dame. So
maybe that's just a little part of it. Let's leave it at that.
Like just a little part of it. But it's just interesting thinking about how, like, when I think of baseball movies that aren't really baseball movies, the only one that immediately comes to mind is The Fan with Snipes and De Niro. That's a movie about a baseball player, but baseball really doesn't have much to do with the movie itself.
For the story that right.
But I think about a movie like I'd referenced it before, Any Given Sunday. Football's in that movie, but it's about Al Pacino and his struggles of being a coach in his life, not about the game of football.
If you going back to basketball for a second, so you mentioned that the stories can be way beyond that, and I think Love and Basketball, and I think you feel the same way, is just I would say that's maybe my number one basketball movie actually.
The thing that's tough about it is it's just such a good movie.
Right.
Even if it really doesn't have that, it's not really about playing basketball, but it's a basketball is the drive. You could have, in some senses, you could have replaced a basketball with a lot of other things, and it would still work in the same way. But the fact that it is basketball is what makes it unique in that sense.
But if you're gonna limit it to like a Hoosiers kind of a movie, or even Coach Carter, right, which is about the team excelling in the college, and then that's kind of a basketball movie. They kind of have the same vibe, which make them different than a movie like White Man Can't Jump, because there's no professional basketball in that, but that's a movie that's a lot about basketball.
And I think that's where you get into like a lot of the interesting conversations about sports movies, because how much does the movie have to be about following a team or a professional player for it to be a sport movie? Because I think if you look at some of the best sports movies, like racing movies actually have been fantastic. There's a lot of really good both car racing and horse racing movies, even if maybe very, very traditional sports fans don't really consider them sports, so to say. It's a competition, but it's still they're great movies. Rush was a fantastic movie. Days of Thunder was a fantastic movie about car racing, and those are about car racing. Ford versus Ferrari.
Right, Ford versus Ferrari. Right? You can keep going, and we didn't even talk about the Fast and the Furious. Does that count as a car race?
Yeah, maybe the first one. I think by like 6 or 7, when they're flying around the world on helicopters doing action stunts, they've been moved a little bit past car racing at this point.
Yeah, I think it's just a man thing to a certain degree, that for whatever reason, I know how silly those movies are, but I watch them all, the Fast and the Furious. It's as absurd as they are. I like watching them.
And I think it's interesting because one of the things is when you look at like the car racing movies, those have actually become a pretty prestigious genre of sports movies in terms of what they've released recently, outside of like Talladega, Legend of Ricky Bobby.
Nights,
yeah, like Legend of Ricky Bobby is a car racing movie. That's a comedy. But then I think the other probably classical prestige genre of sports movies is boxing movies.
Yeah.
That was like
Yeah.
the original genre of like, no, these are not only about boxing, but they're great movies on top of being boxing. And like, you could just go down the list of how many absolutely incredible boxing movies there are. And
Right. And when Rocky came out in 1976, showing my age there, I remember it was made for $600,000. The whole movie. Stallone did everything, script, produced it. I don't think he directed it, but obviously starred in it. And the graphic nature that they used when there was the fight scenes about the sweat and the spit and the blood, that was kind of Raging Bull did the same thing. And boxing movies really depicted that. The earlier boxing movies, and there are a lot of them, right? Because it's always been easy to shoot boxing because it's in a little ring, and even you have all these old gentleman Jim Corbett movies from the 30s, the 40s, and it's a pretty easy sport to shoot in that respect. But the drama and the graphic nature of boxing, I think, makes it a very visual thing for the the viewer and a fun thing to watch.
And I think what it is, when you look at the movies that traditionally, what I'm noticing is it's interesting because baseball is kind of the only one that really escapes it. But when you look at all of these sports that are turning into great movies, it's a lot of the single sports where it's the singular athlete either competing against the field or one other person, because that lends itself to a really good narrative where I think as soon as you get into having to tell the story of a team, it gets a lot harder because you suddenly have to just increase the number of people that are relevant to the story to such a degree. When you're following a boxer, there's the boxer and the people in his life that the movie are about. If you're following a baseball team, you have all of the players and all the people in their lives. If you're trying to do this really detailed movie, that's a lot of characters. It gets hard to write something like that.
So the Will Smith movie Ali, right? Is that a movie about boxing? It's really a movie about Ali, who happened to be a boxer, but I don't know if you would look at it in the same way you might a movie that had a lot more boxing scenes in it. And that movie actually didn't have that many.
And you see even something like $1 Million Baby, which as far as a drama movie is a phenomenal movie, and it is about boxing, but it also isn't, which I think is kind of like the really interesting point to this whole discussion. And I think it's also interesting because one of the solo sports where I'd think it would actually lend itself really well to movie making, and for whatever reason, there's just like not any good movies. There's just no good tennis movies.
No, and I'm a tennis player, and I would try to defend that idiom. If the best tennis movie ever made might be up for an Academy Award this year, possibly, and I haven't seen it. But from what I've read, and I will see it, King Richard, again with Will Smith
movie.
So maybe he's vying with with Adam Sandler and Kevin Costner for the sports movie guy award. Because there just aren't any. I mean, Borg versus McEnroe was not great.
Wimbledon was like Wimbledon a romantic comedy, basically.
Match Point, made by Woody Allen years ago, was just a weird.
It's a Woody Allen movie.
Yeah, true story. And then only made 34 tennis movies, actually, which kind of surprised me in comparison to the 119 for boxing and 109 for car racing, 115. It's interesting that's around the same number for these, right? 115 for horse racing, 114 for soccer, 76 hockey movies, 118 basketball
movies too.
Yes,
I think that's
we'll get to that.
Yeah, that's something that doesn't get enough recognition. Is that hockey actually? There's granted, I'm particularly partial as a millennial that I grew up with the Mighty Duck movies, and the Mighty Ducks movies were all fantastic. Emilio Estevez as Gordon, what was his last name?
Yeah.
It's gonna bug me. I'm blanking.
Gordon, the hockey coach.
Gordon, yeah, he had my name, so of course I'm gonna remember it. But I love those movies. I watched Mighty Ducks 1, 2, and 3 countless number of times growing up, and even then we had stuff like Miracle come out, where I think Miracle was probably able to escape the normal pitfalls of a team-based movie because of the event that it was talking about. There was such a strong narrative event of this team winning the gold medal that it kind of allowed it to surpass some of the normal pitfalls, I think, when you just follow a regular team. For instance, Moneyball as a baseball movie. I think if you strip away the Billy Beane drama and you make it just about that A's team, it's not nearly as interesting a movie.
Right. Right. And you're right. The hockey movies, Miracle, and we already knew the result, right? So you're watching this movie, and somehow they managed to make it suspenseful, even though you know what happened.
Like that to me is the sign of like a really good movie is when you know how it's going to turn out and you still like I watch like one of my favorite, it's not a movie, but one of my favorite anime that I watch, if I'm going to out myself here, is a volleyball one. I've actually read the entire manga that it's based off of, and now they're animating it. I know what's going to happen. I've read everything. I know when they win and I know when they're going to lose. And when I'm watching it, I still get extremely excited because they know how to do the tension when they're displaying it. And I think really good movies, like they get that. They understand how to, even if you know at the end of the movie, the good team is going to win, you still have to create that drama for everybody that makes you think even for just a minute, well, maybe they're not going to win. You have to somehow trick the audience into believing somehow in Miracle that the U.S. actually might lose for a minute.
Against all odds. Oh, that's a different movie. Have you seen Slapshot? I don't think I ever asked you that. I mean, have you actually seen it?
I have never seen Slapshot. I have heard of it. I'm aware of it as a comedy, but I've never watched it myself.
I guess it's a comedy. I didn't really think of it. It was a depiction of the game that a lot of people hadn't seen because it talked about it was dealing with minor league hockey. And so, and because Paul Newman was in it at the time, he was still an aging leading man. That's why they got all that notoriety. But the graphic nature of what hockey was probably something that people hadn't seen before, and that's what made Slapshot, the dirtiness and the blood and all that went into that. How rough the sport was something that I think a lot of people who were not hockey fans per se and didn't know that inherently went, whoa, this game is brutal.
And I think that's what makes it exciting. It allows you to see these sides of the sport. And I think that's why boxing movies do so well is we only see the boxers for the 15 minutes they're in the ring fighting each other. But when you follow their story, like I always remember it was the Mark Wahlberg movie that, was it The Boxer? The Fighter. With Mark Wahlberg and Christian Bale. That was a phenomenal movie because you got to see everything that boxer put in to be who he was, which is why I think you're starting to see. And now I think this is really interesting that you're going to see, I think, a transition away from boxing movies. We've already started seeing that boxing movies to UFC style movies.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
There have been a lot of good ones that have come in. And now, especially because one of the big advantages the UFC style movies have, and it's going to take somebody is that they actually already have a script for how to do all their action scenes. It's called follow what they've been doing in kung fu and martial arts movies for the past 50 years. You already know how to shoot awesome looking martial arts scenes. You could do that in your UFC movies now. And I've seen some really good ones.
You'll see a lot more of those. Yeah.
And especially as that sport gets more and more popular, because I mean, to go off a bit of a tangent, it's strange that the lasting injuries from UFC are as debilitating, but not as dangerous in some respects as boxing because of the way that the blows are interchanged. You're going to mess up your body doing UFC, but you're not just taking repeated blows to the head for like 7-8 years like you do as a boxer. So
and it has every bit the graphic nature, right, of what a boxing movie would. You're going to get all the blood and guts and stuff like that. That make it so like I know when your mom watches a movie and she sees the boxers, she's turning away. She can't even watch, even though she knows it's staged, right? And there's sweat and blood going on, like oh, I can't watch, and a lot of people are like that.
And then but I think that's what you need those movies to draw you in. That's what made Raging Bull so good. That's what made Rocky so good. That's what even makes great baseball movies good, is that they draw you in, and for that 2 hours you're in the theater or watching it, you feel like you understand what it's like to be part of that group. I like, as somebody that's played baseball, that's been in locker rooms, there's that moment where especially when you've watched it and because you've participated, and you're like, yeah, these people knew when they were making this movie what it actually was like. Because when you've played these sports, and I'm sure anybody that's played any sport at a high level, when you watch one of these movies, there's something in the movie that's inevitably going to take you out when you're like, it wouldn't work that way. It doesn't. Like, I always remember when I was watching some baseball show and it was about some young pitcher, and his whole thing was that he didn't ever have the same grip when he threw a fastball. And I'm like, but that wouldn't work. He would literally never know where the ball is going. This wouldn't be a good strategy. And the show's like trying to push this as it's like a great idea. And I'm like, but he's throwing a palm ball. How is this working?
Right, and we all know. Okay, I'm watching a movie. I'm supposed to suspend my disbelief because, looking at all the different movies, and then I started getting into. I was looking at one of the soccer movies that I had. It was about the 1950 World Cup, where the U.S. Beat England in a prelim match against all odds with the usual ragtag bunch. But the amount of liberties they took in the movie when I read the backstory, in order to make the story kind of work. Well, yeah, they had actually played them before, and this guy, their best player, didn't show up for the other. So all these little things that they don't refer to any of that stuff in the movie because it doesn't make for as good a movie.
No, that's the whole thing.
So,
like, you have to dramatize. Now, sometimes you get lucky and the story just works to be super dramatic. The new Kurt
it was
Warner
called The
movie,
Game of Our Lives, by the way. I'm sorry.
the Game of, yeah. It's like when you look at like the new Kurt Warner movie that just came out, American Underdog. Like, okay, yeah, it's gonna work as a movie because here's this guy that was a grocery store shelf stalker that then somehow found himself playing as one of the better quarterbacks of the late 90s, early 2000s and won a Super Bowl. Like, that's just a cool story. It works really well. And maybe we'll be lucky and we'll get a Mike White story someday.
yeah.
One magical
I really like the guy who comes. Right. The magical day that he beat a Super Bowl, team, in front of his adoring fans, never to play again. Oh yeah, definitely. I could see it. Those are like TV movie subject though. I thought that the Kurt Warner, like if it was 40 years ago, it would have been a TV movie. It wouldn't have been a feature movie. They don't have TV movies anymore, right? Release them wherever.
Well, yeah, it'll be Netflix originals now.
Right. So, if I hadn't really thought about doing this, but if you had to pick one or two, let's like just one or two in any of the categories to say this, because and times eras change, so I understand this is just sort of random. Do you have any like favorites? Like, okay, football movie. You want to watch a football movie? My favorite to watch, and either whether it's dated or not, is whatever. And maybe you have a second. Do you have any that you would go to?
For me, it's really tough with football because I'm always torn between two movies that I've actually already talked about, hilariously enough, that are not super about football, but I just love them as movies. And that's Remember the Titans and Any Given Sunday. Those are just both. I think Remember the Titans just because Denzel is so good in that movie, at least the one I watched, because I know there's Brian's Song, which I think is the same story.
Well, Brian's Song was different. That was a TV movie actually, and it was about football, but a lot more than that too. So a little bit dated in today's world.
For me, Remember the Titans, Any Given Sunday, or actually The Blind Side's another movie that's a football movie, but it's not really a football movie. There's so much they don't really play that much football in that movie. So I'd probably go with either Remember the Titans or Any Given Sunday for a football movie. What about you?
One thing I noted when I was looking back at the movies, and I didn't realize, I've forgotten that The Horse Feathers, which is a Marx Brothers movie, is actually a football movie, or at least it's regarded to be a football movie. That would not be at the top of my list. I would probably pick a movie you didn't mention is North Dallas 40. I don't know if you ever saw that movie. That was a movie that came out in the Yeah. That was when you saw Nick Nolte was the star. It was in the 70s. I think Mac Davis, the country singer, was a star. And it showed the guys taking drugs taking pills in order to go out and play the game. And I think for fans like me, young fans at that time, it was kind of like, wow, this is really going on. And it made you think about the game in a way that maybe I didn't every day. So I just remember that particular movie very well. And I also remember Paper Lion, which you've never heard, but a writer named George Plimpton for Sports Illustrated basically got into the Detroit Lions camp and as a quarterback and went through practice with these guys as if he were a guy going to play on the team. And so all the guys, I guess later on they found out when he wrote about it and it was a ruse and he was not really that. They were like, he didn't really look that good out there. Like, this is a writer, a big tall writer trying to play football. How he got as far as he before you got out, it was amazing. Because
players know, as a player when, especially a professional, you would know within seconds. There was a great little video that came out. You can find it on YouTube where Jared Goff when he was still in LA, goes to some JUCO college dressed up as like a new transfer student. And he goes out on the field and they're like, they send him over to the quarterbacks. The coaches are like, oh yeah, this is the new transfer student. We're giving him a look today. And he goes back and he drops back for his first pass and he just throws this seed across the field. And you see all the other quarterbacks just look at each other like, what the hell? Where did this guy come from? Like they could tell from one pass that like, oh, dude, this dude's on another level.
Well, they had one word they all thought of the same word was transfer.
Yeah, transfer. They're like
transfer.
Uh-oh.
This guy, so how about go ahead.
I was gonna say for basketball's hard. I think basketball is probably the hardest one for me because when you're looking at it, there's like a top 4 where it's really tough to pick from any of them in my mind. And so
is Space Jam any of those?
No, as much as the millennial in me loves so here's the thing. Michael Jordan is so bad in the original Space Jam. Like, he just can't act. And it also really bugs me that they try and make me believe Michael Jordan was living in like a 4-bedroom townhouse in the mid-90s. Like, really? He's just living in this little normal-looking house with his family? Hell no. That dude had so much money, he was living in some crazy mansion. Like, at least with the new Space Jam, they don't try and make me believe LeBron is a normal guy. Like, it's very obvious he's LeBron from the beginning of it. I don't know if you've seen it. It's probably a funnier movie just because LeBron is funnier. Like there's a really great joke where like at the beginning he's talking to his son and his other son's behind him and he just goes, man, don't try that. You know I got full court vision while his son is standing behind him. And it's just such a dumb joke, but it was just he's a funny, charming guy. I'm not surprised he can kind of act. But I'd say for me
two things that Michael Jordan was not, by the way, funny and charming.
yeah. And I was going to say an actor and a baseball player.
Well done. So what's your movie? So yeah, where would you go? It wouldn't be Teen Wolf, right?
Wouldn't be Teen Wolf. Wouldn't be Air Bud or Like Mike. I'd say it's either White Men Can't Jump or Love and Basketball.
Good choice. Yeah.
Those are just because those are both phenomenal movies on top of like Hoosiers is a great basketball movie. It's not a great movie when you think about it. Those two are great. And then the other one I want to give a shout out to is the Basketball Diaries.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, right. We should have talked about that. Yeah, I thought that was very well done. And a lot of times, go ahead. I said a lot of times, when you get outside of just a straight narrative story and it's a documentary or whatnot, that's how you can get so many in the category because there's lots of basketball in particular has lots of Hoop Dreams and things of that nature, which are really good movies, but not in the traditional sense in terms of, what the story that you're looking for, the championship drive and things of that nature.
I think
how about ice hockey?
Ice hockey, Mighty Ducks. I get it.
Okay, that's good. I actually would Slapshot and Miracle are great. I'd probably give a shout out to Mystery Alaska. Believe it or not, I think Russell Crowe was the star of that, and they're playing pond hockey. It was a good movie.
Gordon Bombay. That was his character.
Gordon Bombay. There you go.
Yeah, I had to remember it because I just had to remember that. It was bugging me too much. It's been stuck on my head for.
How about originally? Car racing.
Car racing is tough. I want to say Rush. Rush was one of those movies that because Rush also got me into starting to watch F1. And I've really enjoyed starting to follow Formula One. And that's something that's becoming bigger and bigger in America. As far as racing go, I think the team aspect, it makes it very interesting compared to stock car racing. And it was just such an interesting movie that I think what had that advantage over a lot of the other movies. It was such an interesting movie about like history that I had never heard of before. Yeah.
I would put that number one for me also. And I would probably put Days of Thunder just above Ford versus Ferrari, but I really like Ford versus Ferrari also. I mean, we didn't talk much about horse racing. So, any in there that you know?
Seabiscuit. I remember we went to go see Seabiscuit in theaters. I think that might have been a Christmas Eve movie for us one year. That was a really good movie.
Yeah. I agree. And that's a lot about. I like this about horse racing too, and so is Secretariat, where you take a movie like Hidalgo, was with Viggo Mortensen, and it's about this race across the desert, and that was a very good movie, and it was about horse racing, but just not about track racing, right? You know, when you think of horse racing movies, you're thinking they're going around the oval,
exactly,
and this was certainly not that. So, and A Day at the Races by the Marx Brothers should get an honorable mention too. Because that's going way still,
back.
Almost. Yeah. You're talking about 85 years ago. I mean, that's pretty cool. That movie still is relevant. Okay, and how about your top golf movie? You talked about it a little bit.
Yeah, man, this is tough. Like personally, for me, just because as much as I've seen probably my top 3, I kind of have to go with Happy Gilmore because that was like my golf movie, and as an Adam Sandler fan, it was really fun. Even if it's dumb as hell.
I really like. I'm glad they didn't do a sequel. Right? They didn't come back and try to do Happy Gilmore 2.
It's something I have a lot of respect for Sandler for. Is that while he does churn out an unbelievable number of movies, he's never kind of gone back to cash in and do like Billy Madison 2 or Happy Gilmore 2. Like those wouldn't be good movies, and I'm glad he's never done something. Or instead of 8 Crazy Nights, now he's going to do 9 Crazy Nights. Oh!
But what he did do is he was in the remake of The Longest Yard, which was not a great movie when Burt Reynolds was in it, way back when the original.
Burt Reynolds and both of them.
Oh, this is both. Of course, you're right. But I thought actually I liked the second Longest Yard, and I thought Adam Sandler did for a guy who is decidedly does not look like a football player. I think he did a pretty good job.
He did and they brought in they made that an entertaining movie, and I think it was always I always will love the fact that they had Bill Romanowski as the jackass guard that was the bad evil linebacker on the other team. I'm like, that is a very, very accurate casting choice. Good job.
So they've only made 27 wrestling movies, and I don't know if we talked about the Mickey Rourke movie, The Wrestler, which was a disturbing movie and one that you kind of like came out of going, wow.
I don't know if I want to watch that again.
There are a few,
but I'm glad I watched
it. You should. Yeah. And I remember, there's a cult following for Vision Quest with Matthew Modine that came out, which was just really not a good movie. But it was the only wrestling movie for a really long time. And then Steve Carell was the wrestling coach in Foxcatcher, which was also a very disturbing movie.
Yeah, and that was one where I think that the most impressive thing to me about Foxcatcher was that was sort of everybody waking up and being like, oh, Steve Carell could actually act. Like, this guy's a really good actor. Like, he's not just a funny guy.
Yeah.
And there was, we've been talking about movies for a while. There was one thing I did want to bring up that we haven't talked about yet, and that is fake sport movies. So movies about sports that don't actually exist. So an obvious example about this is Rollerball. Sport doesn't exist, and there's been multiple Rollerball movies. And I'd like to think of one that was sort of, it is potentially one of the dumbest movies I've ever watched. And it is very funny, but it is in a complete piece of trash cinema. And that is Basketball by Matt Parker and Trey Stone. Which was,
oh god, that was horrible.
It's such a dumb movie, but you're like, it's a fake sport movie. It is a sports movie. It is about a dumb sport these two idiots made up, but it's a sports movie.
I was thinking when we about that. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I was thinking that Running Man with Arnold Schwarzenegger, is that a sports movie? It's a bizarre movie, but an interesting premise.
I think it's interesting when you start getting away from the traditional definitions of a sports movie, and you're just like, well, it's a competition, and then of course you have movies that are just, it's named like a sports movie, but is most definitely not, like Marathon Man. That is not a sports movie, but it sounds like one.
Right. Perfect. That's exactly right. It is not a sports movie, not in any way.
But it sounds like
I guess we should we should think about, now we got to go back to baseball, and we're going to, drop an episode in a couple of weeks. And I kind of feel like, well, I'm not sure what we're going to talk about. So maybe we'll go back to talking about baseball movies, or maybe we'll, come up with another topic if these guys actually get this thing done.
Yeah. Well, I mean, or if anybody out there has, any interesting sports movies ideas or topics you'd like to hear us talk about, just send us a message, tweet at us, leave a comment on any episode. We'd love to hear if anybody has any great ideas.
So do you think they will play opening day as scheduled or not?
Yes, I do.
Yeah,
because if anything, I almost see because just to go, I think we've had this conversation in the past, but I almost see this as the players' way of leveraging themselves out of having to do spring training. I don't think
we did talk about that. I don't sure if I buy that.
Well, it was only because I understood the purpose for spring training in the past when guys literally had to come back from the off season and get back into playing shape. They don't need to do that. These guys are all in perfect playing shape year round, pretty much. So, only for the pitchers, though. The pitchers and
only for the pitchers because. Right. You got to stretch it out. Pitchers don't go much more than 5 innings. Well, they don't go much more than 5 innings anymore anyway. It used to be they would go 5 innings in early season games and try to stretch it out to 7, 8, and 9 as the season went on. I guess I'm kind of talking out of both sides of my mouth because that doesn't really happen anymore either. So I don't even know why you need spring training if that's the case.
And now if you have a 5 inning start,
Yeah. So I guess, I feel like I keep convincing myself, and I hope I'm not wrong, that these guys aren't so stupid as they're going to mess it up. But, I guess it's possible.
With so many young, exciting players in baseball right now, with such a good season that we had last season, which was really, when you look at it, despite the Mets being the Mets, it was a really great baseball season. There was a ton of really young, exciting new players. And the year after you have breakout seasons from Vlad Guerrero Jr., from Shohei Ohtani, to then ruin that with a strike just seems so short-sighted by baseball that I just can't see them doing it. And I'm very confident we'll be playing baseball this year.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform.
And you can follow us on Twitter at Almost Coop.
The hood.